new way of killing an idea. I think that's eminently quotable, and thank you for giving us that. So join me in thanking the panel.
We have a wonderful panel with a number of returning veterans and Chip Pickering, who's the president of Comptel, former congressman, Karen Kornbluh, former ambassador to the OECD, now at Nielsen, Don Gips, former ambassador to South Africa, now wearing multiple hats, including at the Albright Group, and Rebecca Arbogast, who is at Comcast. I want to acknowledge, in what is really a wonderful and probably unprecedented event, we now have 3 generations of Barnes leaders here. Frank Barnes, who founded the ITP program, which is Interdisciplinary Telecommunications Program, in the 1970s, seeing that policy, technology, and business had to be thought of together. Incredibly farsighted. Very early on, he got a number of people, including Dale Hatfield, on board with this. And his son, Stephen's here. He's been teaching the program, and now his grandson is here as well. This is 3 generations of engineers who are thoughtful about policy, which, as I mentioned earlier, is something that is really important. And it's because of this ITP program I was the first joint appointment to the law school, and so that's great to see. Let me have a seat and get into a discussion with our panel, and it will pick up on some of the themes that we've picked up on the first one. And having 2 former ambassadors, it is fitting to start off with an international point. And I want to just remind people of what Casey and Dave Clark talked about, which is the basic infrastructure of the internet, not the actual wires, but the virtual infrastructure, the code, if you will, is based on open source development. And I think the metaphor was, you know, and maybe Ashkan said this, people in a basement, or slightly more sort of formalized, you would have engineers who come together at the Internet Engineering Task Force. This is a commons in the sense that no one owns this code. It is generally not patented, although the patent concerns may be something we'll talk about, but it's based on this loose coalition that is outside of formal governmental authority. And I think when we talk about trust and fragility of the internet, one of the points that I want to start off this panel is the international accessibility and interoperability of the internet is not something we can take for granted. And the system of governance being as loose as having really what gets called a multi-stakeholder model through organizations like the IETF is also something we can't take for granted. There are a number of challenges now taking root, including the International Telecommunications Union interest in getting more formally involved in overseeing the internet. And it is obviously in the wake of the whole Edward Snowden revelations tied up around concerns as to whether the U.S. controls the internet and is leaving other countries out. So let me start off with our 2 ambassadors. Karen spent a lot of time on this issue. What's the state of international internet governance and the trust or lack thereof in a system that, like I said, really is built on a very informal set of cooperative relationships rather than more formal governmental authority?
Okay, well, I'll start by picking up on something you said at the very beginning, where someone complimented this conference by comparing it to Davos. And having been to Silicon Flatirons 2 years in a row and Davos 2 years in a row, I'm going to flip that compliment and say I think of this as the anti-Davos. And believe me, I think of that as a higher compliment. And that's because of the substantive conversation. I thought the preceding panel was fantastic, and I'm glad that you're picking up where it left off. And I'm sure we'll talk about this at great length today and tomorrow, but in addition to all the technological advances that made the internet possible, and in addition to the entrepreneurialism and private sector investment, obviously the policy framework was incredibly important, and it was very well thought through, and there was a lot of effort put into it. And one of those components was on the international front, where the U.S., after it had put in place this light touch regulatory system, then started working with Europe convinced Europe to pursue a similar approach, and then work through the OECD to take that even further internationally. And Bill and I talked about this when I got the appointment to the ambassador to the OECD, and we decided it was time for a refresh, because even then, before Snowden, we could see that this international consensus was starting to fray, in part because a lot of foreign countries don't think of the internet as a platform for innovation. They think of it as a bunch of US companies, Google being the poster child. And there's even this theory now in France. The French love theories, and they're really good at them. And they have this theory that the US companies are the modern day, some in France, only a few, not everybody in France thinks this, that the over-the-top players are the new imperialists, and they come in and they take their raw material, which is their data, and they manipulate it, manufacture it, and sell it back to them at a big profit. And they see themselves as real victims, and they think they can't compete because they have more strenuous privacy laws. They have different, we can pick and choose among their tax laws. And so they just feel that they don't see a lot of national champions on their side. They see a lot of US companies. And it's a big mistake in that they don't see it as a platform. And then I think in the developing world, there's a lack of, sometimes a lack of understanding as well about, and Don can talk to this, about how they can participate in a lot of the multi-stakeholder mechanisms, how they can benefit from them. And then certainly we have situations like Russia and China is, every day taking more and more steps to change. Now you have to register. In the last few days, you have to register when you go on the internet. I was talking to my colleagues in China the other night. We sent them an article as an attachment. We can't read it. It's a link. You have to send it to us in the body of the. I've talked to researchers in China. How can we do our research? We can't get access to the internet. So this is what the question you're posing is very, very real, and I think the U.S., which has a very big stake, not only because of our companies, but because we really care about this kind of communication and trust worldwide, has a really big stake in articulating the importance of the internet. And this goes to the last question you were asked, the last panel was talking about. What's the value proposition? What are the stakes? We can talk about that more later. Articulating that and then helping, especially the developing world, get online and get the benefits from the internet. And we can talk about the details of that later.
Don, you spent 4 years in South Africa and got to see up close a country that is, wrestling with what they see as the internet and U.S. policy. How do you think about this issue?
I think it's a huge challenge that we're facing. One of the great things about being ambassador is you actually get to see your foreign policy through somebody else's eyes. And look, as you sit there, and I also have done some work with ICANN, so I've spent some time looking at this and was actually worked for Al Gore when we created ICANN, and had this vision of creating this global multi-stakeholder model. And I remember sitting around thinking, we're creating something that reflects our values. It reflects our values of openness, of transparency, and it has become this great engine of growing businesses, growing prosperity and innovation, as we've all talked about. But other countries look at it and say, wait, this doesn't reflect my values. If you're in China, it doesn't reflect how they think about the world. If you're in Brazil, you look at it and say, well, wait, how do my companies fare in this? I think Snowden exacerbated it because even countries that were sort of neutral all of a sudden woke up and said, wait a second, this is being used against me. How do I protect myself? And if you think about it, it's an architecture for global governance that we have to come up with. And that is a huge challenge. And Phil will get to have many, many conferences on this over the next 20 years, because we're at the very beginning of figuring out how do you do this. And the IANA transition, which, they're trying to come up with a global stakeholder model. How do you move this out of Department of Commerce to a global platform, is bringing these issues to a head. And it's also the type of issue that our friends in Congress can easily have fun with, and make these arguments, and really could take us backwards, because this is going to take very sensitive handling to recognize all this, but it's too easy an issue to demagogue. And so I'm very worried about what the next couple of years will bring, because if we don't get the IANA transition right, we're setting up a global debate that I think will be very difficult.
So in Larry Strickling, I say, who loves to be at this conference, I know one of his trusted colleagues, Peter Tenhula, is here. In fact, Peter's here on his birthday, which is a wonderful
Happy
celebration.
birthday.
So thank you, Peter.
Could I follow up on a
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say the work he's doing is on this right now. That's why Larry's not here. So yeah, no, Rebecca, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this issue. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Comcast, I'm at Comcast now, but back in the dark ages was with Karen and Don and the Clinton administration doing international work. And I think that, echoing their points, the Snowden put fuel on the fire, and so it inflamed a lot of stuff. But those issues have been going on for 15 years or more. And I think it goes to both the role of government and in communications, not just ours, but everybody's, as Don was saying, and just cultural, political, and economic forces are very much at stake. And again, back in the dark ages, we did reform of what we call the settlement rate system, the accounting rate system, which was at the end of the year you would net out what a telephone company owed the other one. And long story short, it took away the biggest source of hard currency for a number of developing countries. And so there were a number, I see Ari was with me in those two. A lot of us have scars from those years of reforming the international settlement rates, because the U.S. was very much under attack for years and years and years in the ITU community, because we were taking away money. And then that only applied to the phone system, but a lot of the reaction to that was trying to regulate the payments and the network traffic on the internet as well. And so those issues of regulating the internet traffic were a reaction in part to that settlement rate system. And then you have Google, Amazon, Facebook, those global companies coming up, which I think just increases the envy that the rest of the world has. So we have to be very careful, and we have to keep on doing what our State Department has been doing over the years, and other folks about talking the talk and making sure that we continue with those core philosophies of how important this is to economic development, how important it is to communities, recognizing that we need to be sensitive to the fact that some of our values don't translate directly to what other countries have. But I think we also need to walk the walk as well as talking the talk. We need to do a successful IANA transfer, or that's going to very much put at risk the multi-stakeholder. We need to repair relations after the NSA revelations. We need to be mindful of the opportunistic efforts to try to regulate internet traffic under the guise of reaction to Snowden. And we also need to be, I think, very mindful of the real economic problems with a lot of the developing countries. We're doing some more IXP investment through ISOC, which is helping to get facilities in those countries, and also supporting, through our NBC, supporting local content creation. What I'm struck with when I talk with people from developing countries is it feels very much like when I talk to state and local regulators in rural areas here, which is what they really want to do is just make sure they don't get left behind in the economic and values and progress. And I think that there's some folks who are doing very repressive stuff, but most of them just have what's at heart for their country and their people, and are just trying to do the best they can for them.
So this is an incredibly important point. I want to add something that Dale's very involved in, along with Mickey Gardner, a great American who founded a effort to provide ongoing education for people around the world. And this is the United States Telecom Training Institute, I think, USTTI. And we at Silicon Flatirons host them every summer. And the issue that comes up first is we don't like voice over IP, because we don't get settlement rates on voice over IP. We get it on traditional voice traffic. And that perspective is a challenging one. And I think Don and Karen said it's important to try to have as much empathy as we can to understand how other parts of the world view the internet for us to keep it an international platform. And I want to go to you, Chip, because Don teed this up beautifully. In Congress, these issues look differently. In the IANA transition, which looks like the U.S. is giving up, quote unquote, its control of the internet, looks like a problem. If we don't do it, as Don said, that creates other problems. So with that sort of lens, how do you think about it and help us maybe have more empathy for how Congress's perspective is on this issue?
Yeah. When Don was talking about working with Vice President Gore, I was a freshman in Congress. I wanted to be on the Energy and Commerce Committee, but I was exiled to the Science Committee. And, but it ended up, because so few were there, that I got to chair the subcommittee that had the jurisdiction and the oversight as we transitioned the governance into the commercialization stage of the Internet. And even then, there was a big debate. Do we headquarter in the U.S. or in Geneva? And Congress, and as the subcommittee chair, I got to express congressional intent that we believed it should stay, at that time, a truly American-led governance. As we go now into this next step of transition, as Don said, it really is the Internet and the success of it and the values and the principles that undergird it are so much our values and our principles, and how do we create the trust so that our international partners and countries that are very different than the U.S. can adopt the same values or principles in this new setting. And I think it will take a long process. It will be filled with conflict and strife and struggle, but I do think that the principles are enduring and they are universal. And so with time, I think we can get there. Congress is beginning to reach, I think, a greater sense of acceptance of that transition internationally. And I would say that as one of the stakeholders, Congress should have a continuing seat at the table, but it will be with a much more inclusive international governing body, and that type of balanced approach I hope will get us all from the U.S. to our partners overseas to a place where we have a process. And then the principles will overtake and then drive what I hope will be a good outcome.
Let me get to sort of the world that this country thinks about with the Internet, which is as this fuel for ongoing innovation, economic growth. And now that we have an arc, really a 20-year arc since, let's say, the Netscape IPO, you can see the level of investment, and there's now been a couple cycles where it goes up, it goes down, it goes back up, can be dizzying to people. And a question that many continue to ask is, are these increasing areas of focus? So just to take one popular recent example is Uber's valuation. Is that reflective of a sustainable, ongoing, transformative change that's fueled by the Internet, or are these, bubbles where just a lot of people get very excited and cash gets very cheap and then there'll be a correction? Don, you want to start with this one?
Yeah. I actually think we're entering a new stage, and I'm going to shamelessly steal from a talk that Benedict Evans from Andreessen Horowitz gave, and he gave me permission to steal, so plagiarism being flattery. I think we're actually entering a very different revolution, which is a mobile revolution. Some of the things he talked about in that talk is this new iPhone has 625 times more transistors than a 1995 Pentium. On the weekend that Apple launched the iPhone 6, they sold 25 times more CPU transistors than were in all the PCs on Earth in 1995. Effectively, we're all getting a new pocket supercomputer. In that computer, we're getting frictionless access, new sensors getting created every day, cameras, location, payment capability, and social platforms, and those are just the sensors that exist in this phone. They're multiplying by the day. It's creating a huge revolution, and it's not just in the US. So the number of smartphones will double. They're 2 billion now. They'll double to 4 billion by 2020. The 4 billion people are buying phones every 2 years instead of 1.6 billion people buying PCs every 5 years. We are really moving into a new environment where new businesses can get created that can transform industries. And if you think about technology, there have been stages where, we made software, we made computers, and that was the tech age. And then they get integrated into businesses so that it's sort of like a plant. You don't really see it's there. The Ubers, the Airbnbs are doing something different. They're building businesses around this mobile capability. And I think that's where that huge value comes. And as you add sensors and the Internet of Things, you're creating an incredible runway for value creation globally. And that's where I see the real value getting created. You look how fast Uber is now expanding. I was just in South Africa. In South Africa, it was easier to get, there were no cabs in South Africa. Johannesburg, if any of you have been there, it's almost impossible to get a cab. Ubers are everywhere now. It's created a brand new industry. Now, it's going to create a whole set of new regulatory challenges as Uber's finding out, both here in the US and Europe and India, because they're transforming an industry. Another statistic that Benedict had in his talk, which I found amazing, is Amazon, which we all think of as this colossus, still only accounts for 1% of retail in the United States. So we're at the very early part of this growth curve, and I think the valuations, therefore, can be justified. Doesn't mean all of them are going to be right, but somebody's going to make a lot of money by disrupting businesses here.
Rebecca?
So I'll borrow from, at Comcast, we have a venture capital group it's one of the oldest corporate VC groups. I think Intel and Comcast were two of the original ones. Google and Intel now are, I think, the largest in terms of dollars under management, but Amy Vance runs our VC fund. So I talked to her as we were getting ready for this talk, and just some insights. I mean, there are 150, the statistic she gave me is 150 billion in VC money came into the internet space generally in the last 5 years, which is a lot of money. And her view of it was that we have a perfect storm right now, which is we have a lot of capital that's available, that's looking for a home, that wants to be part of the next early startup Facebook or whatever. So a lot of fluidity of capital. We have, because of, and I will take a little exception to a couple points in the first panel in terms of us not being innovative. I think actually the underlying network folks have been very innovative and created a foundation in terms of lowering costs. So now the cost of per megabit per second just for our industry has gone down 97% since in the last, I think, like 10 years. And so it's very, very easy and cheap to start a company now because we have the network facilities are available, we have storage costs that have gone down, we have computing power that's gone up, so that foundation makes it very easy to start a new company. So when you take that plus a lot of good capital available, it's a perfect storm for creating new companies. So is there a bubble? I think the bear case is you look at just the money that's coming in. So there are some people who are predicting a major correction, and they point to the fact that I think in the third quarter of 2014, the amount of VC money that came into internet companies was the same as it was right before the huge correction in 2001. If you look at NASDAQ, there's a chart that shows the valuations where we're at now are about where they were right before the crash. You talked about the huge valuations that have come into some companies. Uber is one. In their recent round of funding, they now are valued at $41 billion. Which is a lot of money. And WhatsApp, I think, is a company that was recently bought by Facebook for about $20 billion. For the entrepreneurs here at Silicon Flatirons, it was started by two guys at Yahoo in 2009, I think. And when they were purchased by Facebook, the founding fellow made $6.8 billion from that investment, and all the original founders or employees that were there made $160 million from that. So there is hope. But some people, when they look at those numbers, I think that feels like a bubble, sounds like a bubble. So that's the bear case. The bull case, I think, is that the fundamentals are very different than they were 15 years ago when the last bubble crashed, which is we now have I think the numbers Amy gave me were 50 times more people on the internet than there were back then. People are constantly on it. So it's not just you sit at your desk. It's Don's point about the mobile revolution. The network facility, the network capability supports much more. If you're starting a company that is a consumer-facing company, which many of these are, you can get marketing through social media. With the credit card availability, PayPal, and that, you can instantly monetize stuff in a way that you couldn't 15 years ago. So I think most people would say that there's some possibility of some correction. What I hear is like a 10-15% correction, but nothing like that plummeting. And what most people are saying is what Amy told me, which is she sees about 20 to 30 years of a good, solid runway of very, very robust growth.
So Karen, at Nielsen, one of the challenges you have is capturing the audience in a world that looks nothing like the old world, where people actually watched video programming over conventional connections at the time that the shows were aired. What's your take on sort of where we are in this cycle of internet transformation?
So it's interesting that you start with Nielsen. So we've just renamed our basic report on video viewing to the total audience. It was called the cross-platform before that, or before that it was TV ratings. Mm-hmm. So we've moved from just monitoring what people watch, aggregating what people watch on television to what they watch online to what they watch on mobile, and then shifted the focus to the person. It's really about the person and what they're watching, or people, because I keep editing myself because it's very, very privacy protected, not only in terms of the fact that the panel, the survey, is an opt-in one, but also in that all the data is aggregated and anonymized. But yes, the mobile revolution that Don was talking about is here, and it's real. I think this is the first year that half of all emails were opened on a mobile device. We're never going back. You know, the amount of video that's on mobile devices. And what's interesting is trying to capture that fragmented audience. You can't have a panel that's big enough to capture all that. So you have to start to combine the rigor of a panel with some of the big data sets that are out there. And that's what we're doing, merging those and then also building the privacy in from the beginning. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the preceding panel, obviously, was the talk about ad revenue. And what I would just urge us all to do, because we come from this telecom and internet world, is just expand the value proposition more broadly when we want to think about what the value proposition is. And to go back to the 90s as a touch point, what happened there was that the U.S. had a productivity crisis. We'd had a productivity crisis since 1973. An economist famously said, computers are everywhere except in the productivity statistics. The internet had been invented, but it really took policy to allow it to work off the underlying network and connect all those computers and make companies vastly more productive in an unimaginable way. We thought we were losing out to the Japanese, couldn't possibly be productive. That was a value proposition that went beyond the telecom sector. And I think the value propositions that we're looking at now, whether it's in energy through the Internet of Things or other means, in education and healthcare, and not just in the US. And if you look at India and you think about how they can leapfrog in terms of development, if they get that mobile technology out into their villages, I think it's quite amazing. So I guess to tie it back to your bubble question, I'd rather us not look at stock valuations. So when I was writing in the early 90s after we came out of the FCC and I was trying to understand what we had done, and everyone was talking about how there'd been this bubble, what I said at that time, and I'd say now, is these are not ordinary bubbles. They're more like a railroad bubble, where people might lose some money. In that time, in the early 2000s, people were losing money, but we'd crisscross the country with fiber optic networks that were going to have real ongoing value.
So Chip, that's a great setup for you. Do you see fiber investment as sort of the, what's happening in a ongoing transformation like railroads? And to give a shout out, we have two great fiber companies headquartered here in Colorado, Zayo, which Don's on the board of, and Level 3 that Don's a veteran of. Is that movement one you see ongoing trajectory, or do you worry about sort of there being the boom and bust cycles and delays in sort of this transformation?
We're beginning to see, because of the internet service, creating a new driver. So Donald was talking about mobility, and I can remember when we had 50 million subscribers in the U.S., and now we have 300 million. And then you look internationally, and we're going from 2 billion to 4 billion smartphone users. So what can we bring into the fiber incentives and economic drivers today that would give us an optimistic hope that we'll see massive or major new deployments of new networks and fiber in every corner of the country? And we're beginning to see that emerge. Google Fiber, as they go into Kansas City, Provo, Austin, AT&T is saying that they'll go into 21 cities with gigabit networks. Cox, C-Spire Fiber, co-ops, TDS, Windstream. So from telcos to cable to new entrant like Google Fiber, to C-Spire Fiber, others, because of internet service, you now have what we had in the wireless market happening in the internet market. And what that did for wireless networks, you saw an explosion in a relatively short period of time. We've gone through 4 generations of technologies in wireless. If you look at the last piece of the puzzle of competitive policy that we have not yet had the type of competition that we would like, it's in the last mile. I'm very cautiously optimistic if we get the right internet policy, the right merger actions on competitive structure in our economy, that competition will drive a very robust fiber as well as wireless deployment of broadband services. And so that this boom bust, I think that the market, that's driven by whether it's the Internet of Medicine, the Internet of Things, the Internet of Cars, the Internet of you name it. Uber, we could have the Uber of telemedicine if you think about coming. And all of those things are going to create this huge, huge market. If we have the right policies and the right industry structure, we'll see major new investments in last mile fiber and wireless broadband networks.
So I have to, in honor of Dale Hatfield, make clear that when you talk about the explosion of wireless, the wireless is not even the last mile. It could be the last 200 feet till you get to a tower that then puts it onto fiber. So the explosion of wireless demand is only in the very last bit. It's all still going to get put on fiber, and so the ecosystem all fits together. Don, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, Zayo and Jack talked about this as well at level 3. A huge part of what the fiber build-out happening in the United States is building first to the towers, but then to the small cell. And I think that as that fiber gets deeper, it lets you put more businesses on that. It lets you do more Wi-Fi. The further out it gets, and wireless is really driving it today. You only need to look at what the carriers spend in the auctions to see where this is all going and how we're going to keep building. This is happening in Europe. It's happening in the U.S. It's happening in Africa. People are building the fiber to meet the wireless demand because that's where people are going. And just one other factor that shows how pervasive that is, in the U.S. last year, people spent more time on mobile apps than they did on the web. So it's a real tipping point, and that's where people are spending time, which means the fiber has to match that.
So the next question is one the first panel visited about. I'd like to ask your thoughts on this. As you look ahead, say next 15 years, and think about where there are threats and potential challenges to ongoing growth and innovation, the first panel put a real sharp focus on security, lack of trust in these networks, and then also, I thought, made some very observant points about the patent system as an impediment to solving that problem. What other concerns would you add in terms of the role of policy? And Chip, you've already sort of adverted to this, not too cryptically, so let me let you expand. When you have your cautious, optimistic view about what could happen with the right policy framework, what are you depending on, and what would be a threat if things went a different way?
Well, there are a couple of elephants in the room that I guess I'll go ahead and address.
You can actually talk about net neutrality.
Net neutrality, our open internet, as we will kind of talk through and see action in the next few weeks. You know, I really believe that we're about to have decisions made that will, you know, put in rules or enshrine, you know, the principles of an open internet. And sometimes we get caught up and we lose the forest for the trees. And we get caught up in, okay, is it 706 or Title II? Is it heavy-handed? Is it light-handed? Is it utility? That's not what this is about. This is about codifying what is in essence a free trade, free market policy that you're not going to block, you're not going to have barriers to entry, you're not going to prioritize, so there's no preference, you have equal access. Now, from a Republican, those are free market, free trade principles. And it creates the largest market of interconnected, interoperable networks where you can have the innovation of the internet business model. Now, we're in what this is really about is a transition from old business models in the cable and the telephone industry to a new business model based on the internet business model. And the internet business model, if we're all openly and honest in the conversation, is a more efficient economic model. Not only is it more efficient, it creates, you know, platforms of good as far as free expression and connectivity of communities and education and all the other public good that comes from it. So we're about to see that adopted. And I think it's also the second thing it's about is having legal, sustainable regulatory certainty. Now, there's going to be a great disagreement and clash and conflict in Washington, but just as where two rivers meet and there's turmoil and high waves and current and strong current, we're going to get past that, and then it's going to be settled. And we really haven't had that settled over the last 5 years. And I think going forward, it's going to be settled and certain and predictable, and we'll all invest more, innovate more, and compete more because we have this decision made. So I'll stop there.
It's worth noting, you mentioned sort of your party background. This has been obscured, but is worth highlighting. The Republicans in Congress have endorsed the substance of the net neutrality rules very similar to what is being proposed by the FCC. So in terms of being optimistic about net neutrality, not just being some, you know, academic curiosity or something that gets talked about at conferences like this, it is actually becoming enshrined. Exactly the legal basis, like you said, that's going to work its way out. Karen, other than net neutrality getting sort of, you know, put into a, say, normalized place, what else would you put as sort of things that you're concerned about that could get in the way of innovation and ongoing technological development in this area?
Well, I tend to be an innovation optimist, and maybe that's my concern, that we tend to focus our policy on the negatives. And of course we have to, and we have to, I think it's really helpful when the government is clear about what needs to be built in from the beginning so that people do. I mean, I found it really helpful in my job when the FTC will issue a report. It will make it very clear what we need to think about. But I do think there's a role for policy to be a cheerleader as well about innovation and to set some directions. And I remember when Don hired me at the FCC, he said, so the vice president wants to make sure that a girl in Carthage, Tennessee can get access to the Library of Congress. Could you figure that out? But the government had a goal, you know, which was access to information and education. And that led to the E-rate. So I do think that the government has played a role. I mean, you know, in the last few years, we don't celebrate this, has been the take-up of the app economy. The U.S. is a leader in new wireless technologies. There's been an awful lot we can celebrate. And I think we don't do that enough. And I think we need to set some really, they call them big, hairy, audacious goals. I think we need to set some of those and then keep telling ourselves whether we're achieving them or not. And those, of course, would be in energy, education, healthcare, and then just broadly economic growth and inclusion. That's an enormous, I think sometimes we pit equity and distribution against growth. And I think you'll see that in the upcoming presidential election. I think the smart Republicans will be talking about growth, and the smart Democrats will be talking about equity and equality. But I think what we're talking about here is too often lacking in that conversation. We need to mainstream this conversation into that one, which is you can achieve both of those things through innovation and growth. And so I urge us to be really big and bold about
Well,
that.
and that gets back to the international conversation where those same issues get played out as well. Don?
So you guys now have realized one of my secrets in life, which is hire people much smarter than I am and then give them a hard problem and get out of their way. If I put my U.S. hat on, I worry about two things, and one is immigration. If we keep mucking around with our immigration laws and don't make it welcoming for entrepreneurs to view this as the place where they want to come, we're going to see it happen elsewhere. And, I look at what's happening in South Africa, I look at where they're trying to build their own Silicon Valley, I look at what's happening in India, around the world. There's nothing that says we continue to own this. And as a matter of fact, when you look at where the users are, they're not here. So if you really want to develop apps to serve the bottom of the pyramid, which is where the great bulk of users are, maybe you shouldn't be here. And I think this is a big coming challenge for us. And one only need to look at Alibaba's market valuation to start to see proof of that. And it could start to shift away from us. And immigration is the one and easiest thing we could do to stop that from happening.
Rebecca?
So I was going to say, well, I think in terms of what we need to be sure to promote and continue is I think the foundational principle for innovation, everything, all the other good growth stuff we've been talking about is to have a regulatory and a policy and a cultural climate that supports risk-taking. I think that's what's led this growth from the beginning. It wasn't by accident. It was a combination of very, very, very good policy under the Clinton administration and then a lot of capital risk-taking by the private companies. So I think that's fundamentally what we need to be sure that we can support. What I think is the most threat to our sector is probably Title II. I won't go into that. I think open internet, everybody is.
I think Phil purposely put Karen
Yeah.
between Karen and I.
But just to be clear, and I'm not going to dwell on this, we are, as a company, completely in favor of net neutrality rules, open internet. We agreed to abide by them even if the court struck them down. We have no plans on paid prioritization. On Title II versus another way of getting there, I think it's not the forest for the trees. I think it's actually a fundamental move by the government walking away from what's been a couple of decades of very wise policy. And the only thing I will say is quoting two folks I think most people here know or know of is Jerry Fallhaber and Dave Farber, who were chief technologists and chief economists at the FCC under the Clinton administration, whose comment in an MIT technology review was talking about the open internet discussion. He says, but what could go wrong if the FCC decides to put a few rules in place? Plenty. The history of telecommunications regulation tells a sorry story of glacial decision-making, focusing on yesterday's problems, inhibition of innovation, and worst of all, what economists call rent-seeking, businesses' use of the regulatory process to put their competitors at a disadvantage. Yes, the open internet is in danger, but not from lack of neutrality, but from the prospect of the FCC regulating it like a 20th century utility. I couldn't have said it better. So that goes to that issue. In terms of, I think, more macro issues, my biggest concern is the trust issue that you all were talking about. Dave and Casey at their event in November asked what their aspirations, but what they also thought was the biggest threat. And mine, I said, was sort of this weird apocalyptic thing that the whole thing melts down because of what everybody was talking about on the first panel. I think that, in some ways, is the biggest threat to us in terms of going forward. I'm traveling. Both of my credit cards got hacked while I was coming out to Colorado. I had 2 credit cards. I couldn't do anything. So I finally figured out how to get a wad of cash from somebody so that I could do what I needed to do. And I thought, that's not good. And reading about Anthem and the hacking of the health insurance stuff, I think is really, really, really troubling and really important, particularly when it's about very sensitive information. My worry about, I was talking with Dave Clark about this last night at dinner, is if everything's going to medical records, and then what I read in the paper anyway was that some of these records, the people's health records, the people whose health records were hacked, are being blackmailed, saying that they won't, if they don't pay them money, then they will, disclose what was in their health records. That is not good for medical care if you have to go in and hide things from your doctor. So that trust issue, I think, is a big problem. My big concern, personally, I think, is where we are in education. I think that if we don't get the education, particularly the public education stuff, right, we are in huge trouble. I think you were talking about, I think it's right to talk about us being on the cutting edge of innovation, having the best software engineers, having the best engineers, all those very forefront people, but I worry that we leave behind the people who are going to be doing a lot of the work that needs to be done to have a fair and a full and a participatory economy. And so that, I think, it fundamentally is probably one of my bigger issues.
So my last question, then we'll get to the audience, is where you have these issues, whether they are cybersecurity, you mentioned Anthem, whether it's patents that came up before, or whether it's network neutrality, however it's grounded, you need institutions of governance to be able to address them. And a challenge in a faster moving technological environment is how do you have institutions that can keep up? I'd love to hear from the panel their thoughts on solving that challenge. Don, you want to take your shot first?
It's funny. My office is I work with Secretary Albright, Madeleine Albright, and she has this saying that people are talking to governments with 21st century technology. Governments are hearing them with 20th century technology, and they're responding with 19th century technology. It's a huge challenge, and it's not a U.S. challenge. It's a global challenge because these issues have to take place in global forums. And, if anybody's ever been to an ITU meeting, that's not actually going to be the most fast, responsive, quickest place to debate technology issues.
Or the U.S. Congress, for that matter.
Right. It's interesting, and it's one of the things that's incredibly cool. And if you haven't ever done it, it's worth either going or looking online at an ICANN meeting. Because it is it's chaos. But it's global chaos. They bring in people from around the world, and, believe me, I don't think they've perfected the model, and Fauci would be the first one to say it, but they're at least trying an experiment to figure out how do you involve these multi-stakeholders in a conversation that allows you to change and build consensus. That's that sort of model, which when we were first talking about it back in the days in the Clinton administration, I have to say I thought it was crazy that they could pull it off. But they sort of have. It sort of works. But it's now colliding fast with big government trying to figure out how do we control things, that are challenging our national security, the privacy of our citizens, and our economy. And so it's going to be one of these great debates, which that's why I said you'll have many conferences to do for many years.
Well, and we'll have many conferences before Congress actually does amend the communications laws. Its last effort came just at the perfectly wrong time, because had the act been the 1999 or 2000 act, the internet and wireless would have been more central as opposed to very peripheral. So, Chip, you have a lot of expertise, having seen the challenge of one governmental institution, Congress, trying to work around fast-moving technology. What are your thoughts on this issue?
When you talk about technology or internet and governance, you think of one as dynamic, and governance as dull, divided, partisan, polarized, dysfunctional, slow. And so how do you capture a technology, information, internet-based economy with the structures of government that we have? I happen to be an institutionalist. I love Congress. I love the fights. I love the battles. I love the clash. I love finally reaching an agreement that everybody can celebrate. So when it works is what the founders intended. It is to create a more perfect union and a more unified and more cohesive country. When it doesn't work, we remain divided and polarized. So how do we restore, kind of the era that Don and I got to experience in the 90s, when a Republican Congress and a Democratic president seemed to want to reform everything and just about did. If you think about that period, our budgets were balanced, we had surplus, we did telecom reform, farm reform, immigration reform, healthcare reform. We
Welfare
really,
to work.
Yeah, so welfare to work and welfare reform. We really restructured our policy to fit our economy in a much better way than we've been able to do over the last 15 years. So my hope is, whether it is kind of a coalescing bipartisan agreement on principles for the internet between the administration and the FCC and what's happening in Congress, that we can restore this bipartisan compact that we've had, that we're going to promote competition and we're going to try to reduce or lessen regulation as much as possible, so that the decentralized forces of competition and innovation are more dominant and can actually lead the governing institutions and pull them along until they eventually reflect them. And that's, I'm a eternal optimist, and so I'm hoping that this is the cycle. If you look from, say, great legislative productivity in 64, 65, 81, 82 in the early Reagan days, 95, 96, 97, Clinton, you have cycles of this great consensus that eventually has occurred in our country. I'm hoping we're about to have another historic cycle of cooperation and consensus. It may be in 2016 and not in 2015.
Can I just agree?
Please.
Can I just wholeheartedly agree with that? I was at a shop after I got my wad of cash over the weekend, and
It was burning a hole in your pocket.
yeah, exactly. Boulder has a great shop, and somebody said, "Oh, that's great. That looks so 90s." And the young woman who was there said, "Oh, 90s? Like, that was horrible." I was thinking maybe for fashion, but it was such. I mean, just think about how much we got done in that period of time that we're still taking the benefits of.
One thing, by the way, a quote from Jim Crow, the former CEO of Level 3 that's out there is, regulation in internet and technology markets should be like garlic in cooking, used sparingly and carefully. So,
But because I actually think, and I agree, but I also think, and we represent a bunch of clients in the tech industry overseas, the arrogance of the tech community also needs to be curbed a little, because, I mean, these are real problems that these countries are struggling with.
getting back to Uber's conversation,
Right.
They, I think, thought they could live without any regulatory oversight at all. They had a brash entrepreneurial CEO, and they're now having to figure out how to, manage in a world where it's not going to be quite so simple for them.
There's one company we represent, I won't say who, but we were talking with them, and they said, we're just going to ignore all these rules. And, they won't catch us. We'll just be faster than them. That's not a recipe for getting to this golden era of success and trying to figure out how we bring together the technology age with the not using too much garlic and get people in government comfortable with where we're heading.
Yeah, if you want to see a great example of that on TV, if you see the show Veep, when she goes to Silicon Valley and she goes to this company, Clovis, and they say, "Oh, we don't want to talk about government. We don't get involved in policy. However, there is this one tax issue we'd like to talk about." But I just picking up on this use of the word reform, which I think is just such a great word. I think there was this great flourishing of academic discussion about regulation and how there was regulatory capture and how regulation could lead to bad things, and then there was a wave of deregulatory policy. And the word deregulation became quite fashionable, and people used that in the 90s when what was really going on was reform, I think, and smart regulation and setting frameworks. And I think we should be really careful about that, to pick up on Don's point. that setting frameworks doesn't have to be a bad thing. And again, going back to when Phil was coaching me when we were doing the internet policymaking principles, he said, let's do 2 pages. Let's do high-level principles and then get agreement. And we got agreement on those principles in a way they wound up being 6 pages, but I think still true to your instruction, the second Weiser rule. And we got agreement among different parts of the industry in different countries in a way that hadn't been, right after SOPA, PIPA were blowing up, because we kept it high level and focused on the things that we want to focus on. The other thing that I would just throw out there is I think we need to think about this equity issue, and some people call it entitlement reform. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but we have to think about how to share the benefits of all this innovation in a smart way, and whether it's making sure everybody has access to great education, health care, retirement security, even as they're taking risks, starting a new company, and so on. We've had an employer-based system of benefits, and if we want people to take risks, and we're spreading risk as we are, then we need to make sure that people have at least a basic cushion. Childcare, I would put in that, family leave. We need to figure that system out. It can't be every company that's paying for it, and it can't be individual families that are bearing that risk.
So let's go to the first Weiser rule and get a couple student questions on the table. I'm happy to go and start with our third generation.
My first question is, there seems to be a lot of problems with communication between innovators and policymakers. So I'm just going to ask directly, to what extent do policymakers understand the innovation of our era, and also both overseas and here? And to what extent do innovators understand the policies that inform their decisions? Also, what kinds of innovators do you see who understand policy, and what kinds of policymakers understand innovation? Is it the younger ones, the older ones? What general characteristics do you see?
I was going to let Don start, but I think, Rebecca, you want to start.
Just a quick reaction. I don't think it's necessarily age. It may be, but I think, and I know that this is totally politically incorrect in D.C., but I think that some of the best people with the best perspectives are people who have worked in government, who have worked in a company, who have worked in an advocacy group. If you've got that perspective from a lot of different places, I think that helps inform, I think, both the policy and the innovation.
So this is an important point, and I think Don and Karen talked about it from thinking about abroad. If you can see both sides, the worst thing happens when two sides demonize each other without knowing each other. That's the worst situation.
But can I say that I was hinting at this before, but I want to be really more explicit. There's an incredibly important role for universities and academics in helping to inform people in government, because they just don't have time to get smart, and they pull frameworks and ideas off the shelf. And if you're thinking through the next iteration of growth economics and how it should be translated into smart government, that's going to be so helpful for people in the government, especially if they have the skills to absorb it the way Rebecca and Phil have just articulated. And then I would say they need to have some basic underpinnings in economics, and they need to have taken a class with Dale Hatfield.
Other questions? Let's go back to, right, we want to try to get another student if we have one, or I'm happy to call on one if need be. Okay, let's go, Ariel, right back there.
Did you raise your hand?
Nope.
That's background stuff.
This is on. I guess just generally for someone that's just entering this field, what's the best piece of advice, or what should we be looking out for someone just entering this and just kind of getting a grasp on it?
Advice for young professionals getting to this technology world, what would you recommend?
I'm going to take the public policy path first, and then we'll let others give the private sector paths first. Now, if you can have an opportunity to go to Washington and work in a congressional office or in a federal agency or a department and understand how policy shapes the economy and decisions that companies then make and how they invest or innovate, and the network of relationships that you will develop when everyone comes to this hub of decision-making in Washington. And it's both I represent companies from Google and Netflix, Amazon and Twitter to Level 3 and Backbone and competitors and wireless companies like T-Mobile and Sprint. And so I'm constantly learning what the private sector is doing, and then I have to communicate it to the policymakers as to what effect it will have in the marketplace when they make their decisions. And so understanding both, as Rebecca was saying, and then being able, whatever you do in your life, to be able to integrate, what is happening in the private market with decisions in public policy can be of great value and is a unique skill set that not many have, and it can set you apart, and anything that makes you distinct in your career will help enhance your career and develop great opportunities for you.
And just to add to that and sort of build on the last question, I actually think, and Rebecca said this too, elected officials have a huge amount on their plate, and if they're in our Congress, they're spending, I don't know what % of their time doing fundraising, but they don't have the time to keep up. I like try and follow the tech industry, and I can't keep up, and I don't even have a real job. So, this is like hard to stay on top of this also. They need translators. They need people who've been in both these worlds who can talk about, okay, this is what Jeff Bezos is really thinking when he's trying to build out Amazon, and help translate that to, here's why taxation done this way doesn't work for that. And those are roles that you guys are being uniquely trained here at CU to go to understand that private and public intersection and help be those translators.
The only other thing I'd add, and I think my main advice would be just to get as much experience in as many different things as you can. One of the things I'd say is a long-term prospect, and I remember this when I was at the FCC and would have people coming in trying to get us to make a decision one way or the other. The people who I found the most valuable were the ones who could take off their institutional hat at any given moment and think about what's the larger good for the country. I know that sounds very corny, but I think that will also make a career more satisfying to you if you can kind of anchor yourself in that, and just always be honest. I mean, that's the other advice, because if you don't do that...
So two great thoughts, two things on being a really great lawyer. One is know the difference between a good argument and a bad argument. The most frustrating thing, which is people are being intellectually dishonest, is when they pretend a bad argument is a good argument. It's sort of maddening. Dale would say he'd have people come to him and they could kind of wink when they were making an argument they kind of had to make, but they didn't totally, want to put their stock in. Yeah. The other thing I'd say here is this point about Don, about being a translator. It is so important. The most underdeveloped concept that lawyers and policy professionals need is empathy. It's a really nice concept that's come out, which is if you understand where people are at, it applies internationally. It applies for, tech entrepreneurs, not demonizing government officials. It's trying to understand, okay, where are they coming from and how can you translate between often two different worlds. Yep.
So there's been a tremendous need in rural America for the promulgation of better networks. They've been abandoned by many of the incumbents in a variety of territories, and there's been a great uprising of municipally owned networks or public-private partnerships. We see that in the comments from Commissioner Wheeler. We saw that in the comments from the President in the State of the Union address. I'm just interested in the perspective of the panel of the rise of the municipal networks or the municipal public-private partnerships and what that will do to shape the future.
So let me break out. I think there's sort of two questions there, Dave. First is the digital divide, a topic we'll explore next fall, a topic that Karen's really been hitting on hard in this panel. Thoughts on the challenges around what's often called universal service, and specifically, what's the role of municipal networks or municipal actors in addressing that issue? Who wants to take a whack at that?
I'll do just a quick one. So I think that going back to the first remarks, I think one of the biggest challenges we have in this country is a digital divide, both in terms of deployment. I think where the market's not working and where there isn't enough consumer base, we have a weird country in terms of our urbanicity is not as great as it is in a lot of places. And I think those are real challenges. And like I said, on the international scene, whenever I'm talking with state and local people, the same concerns as I talk to when I'm on the USTTI board that Phil mentioned, just how do we get that built out? And I think one of the it's a huge legitimate role for government is to figure out how to reform our universal service system. I think the FCC keeps making a run at it, but I think frankly we're not there yet in terms of how we fix that problem. The other one is the adoption issue, which Karen alluded to. It's a huge issue that we cannot walk away from because we're just at risk for leaving whole chunks of people behind. And the biggest determinant of that is the biggest factor that determines whether you're online or not is education. And that's an issue that's not going to be going away. So in terms of, back to your question on the muni stuff, I think that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. I think every different community has to figure out what's going to work for it. I think that part of that question has to be decided against the other needs for capital and what your education, what your roads, what your the infrastructure is that your needs are for. So I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all answer for what's the best role of the municipalities in this.
Don?
I'd comment a little bit on the international because this will be somewhat controversial, but I actually think the access issue internationally is getting solved, and you don't need to worry about it. $35 Android smartphones and some of the numbers I was talking about, if you look at the statistics right now, it looks like in Africa, way more people have access to smartphones and internet than they will to power. Mm-hmm. And so people are building
clean water.
Clean water. So phones are outstripping or computing power because Android smartphones have that, and 4G networks are getting built. I went to Kenya 6 years ago, and we were in this small village and didn't have power, nothing, and I was trying to reach somebody. I took out my cell phone. I had 4 bars. Mm-hmm. My BlackBerry. I don't get that in most places in the United States. So I think this is part of why the mobile revolution is so compelling, is it is solving the access issue. There's a very significant issue, though, which I do think USTTI and others need to keep addressing, which is building the capability of government officials to understand how do we build a system to create a pro-competitive environment to manage that.
Well, and part of that is we take it for granted in this country, and this gets back to this question about lawyers, the rule of law and being able to set up a framework so when people build a network, they have some, we talked about certainty. Our issues around certainty and net neutrality are nothing compared to like someone's going to take your network tomorrow. You can't do anything about it. That's a much bigger challenge to entrepreneurship than anything we see in this country.
Some of you may know Peter Cowie, who's at USC, and he worked
for me.
Yes. Yeah. So I asked him at one point. He's a very bright guy who comes in and out of government and academics, and asked him at one point, how do you solve this deployment issue in developing countries? He said, it's not hard. He said, all you need is like 3 things. You need a clean and functional government.
Yeah, easier said than done.
and then you need mobile stuff. But it was like that first point was assume a can opener. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. We got one back here, and then we'll give Frank the final one.
So my question is about what you see happening in the U.S. with multilingual content integration. To Don's point, I got an email 2 days ago from my Cuban cousin in Spain from his Android saying to me, let's talk on WhatsApp this weekend. And I was worried about him not having internet access in Cuba, but he's on his Android using WhatsApp. And so you mentioned immigration. The other side of that risk to U.S. innovation is if we fall behind other regions in developing tools used by billions of people. seems like the assumption of English as the de facto language of the internet is short-lived. So I would love to see what you see on the landscape for multilingual content integration. There's a conference in Latvia, for example, in April with the W3C, but I don't see a lot happening in the US, and that worries me.
I don't know. So,
Ambassador?
as somebody who barely can speak English, you're asking the wrong person. But it's, you know, my kids who are constant, because we lived overseas, their friends are from all different parts of the world, and they speak, their native tongue is quite different. It's amazing to me that they actually communicate through Google, and one will write in their native language, and the other just translates it using Google Translate. It's often quite amusing, but it's gonna get there. And I think because there's money to be made in doing this well, it's not a problem I'm that worried about. I think, and the Chinese are investing, Alibaba in particular evidently, is investing a significant amount in figuring out how to create these platforms that allow people to speak across different languages seamlessly.
Well, this gets to that this is happening, this multi-language integration. It's threatening for countries, getting back to France, who wants to maintain their native culture, and the global nature of the internet is really at war with that. And part of what China is doing is trying to maintain its control in this international environment. Don, you're pretty optimistic that one force is inevitable there. The other idea is the internet itself gets fractured in an effort to maintain sort of the, you know, independent domains.
I think there's a lot of really interesting work to be done in this area. I don't know if there are a lot of policy, there are certainly policy implications, but I'm almost more interested in the academic work here. I mean, the tensions that you just pointed out are some, you know, the FTC and the White House have been talking about possible discriminatory effects of algorithms if they tend to isolate people by race or by ethnicity, and yet there are also benefits for disaggregating people and not assuming everyone has the same interest, but that we do these reports on the African American consumer, the Hispanic consumer, and point out ways that marketers should not ignore different cultural purchasing patterns because they can get washed out in the aggregated data. So I think there's a really interesting points to be made about the tension and to tease them out between preserving cultures and protecting cultures, but also you know, having this single internet and the benefits of that, and not discriminating.
Give Frank the mic.
The question I wanted to ask, with this on, yeah. The question I wanted to ask is, how do you look at the situation where the law supports the people in power versus the open access situation? Because you certainly have governments that want to see that they control the information that goes to people. And yet, if you look at the global scope of things, it moves in the opposite direction. How do we look at that conflict?
I mean, I think that we need to have patience. I think the trends are inconsistent in the sense that we still see Iran, China, some places with very closed systems. But I was having dinner with somebody last night talking about one of their students, who's a graduate student, was talking about, despite the fact that China was so closed, compared to what things were like 10 or 20 years ago, there was this incredible flourishing of political speech even within the country. So I think that, and what Karen was talking about, the tension between sort of long tail, the ability to create very small niche communities because of the internet, as well as this mass, you know, conversation that we can all have. So I think there will be just these continued tensions, but of all the things that are out there that I worry about, this one I actually feel the most hopeful about.
I mean, it's really interesting. You're watching, I think Turkey's one of the most fascinating countries to watch as this is going on right now, because it started as a very open, very vibrant public space, and now it's closing and then opening because there's popular resistance. They keep going back and forth, so you can watch in real time as they're trying to figure this out, and it's it comes down to power, right? How the people in power, they're weighing, does silencing dissent let me stay in power, or is it going to create such a backlash that that's what's going to be taking me out of power? And China's going through similar debates all the time. And I think time will, I agree with Rebecca, over time, and Chip said this earlier, our values win out because they're the universal values, but I think we have to be patient as we go through that.
And let me just add what Don and Karen and others have mentioned. The only time I've seen success in policymaking or in governance is when groups sit down from both sides of the aisle or two sides of a competing, conflicting issue. And they say, first, let's try to negotiate principles that we can agree upon. And so if you ever can get to that stage, that you'll simply work on your principles. When we did the 1996 Act, I was a Senate staffer, and we celebrate the birth of the 96 Act today, 19 years. We couldn't get anywhere until we sat down first with the Republicans and we agreed on principles, and then we sat down with Democrats on the Senate Commerce Committee staff, and we negotiated principles with them. And once we had a bipartisan set of principles, we passed it through the Senate in 5 months. Now, that is like a record time. That's like on jet fuel. But it was because we spent about 3 months negotiating principles. And the governance, and that process and principle combination, whether it is American governance or international internet governance, over time gets to a place where people with very different viewpoints and perspectives and cultures can agree to the principle and then implement those. And we just have to sit at the table until the principles that we share around the internet are adopted internationally, shared, and then executed. And what we're seeing is that the popular will does not want to let go of an open and free internet. And once it's rooted,
once people get access to it,
you cannot unroot it. And that's what we have to count on.
Well, we have to sit at a new table for lunch, and I would encourage, again, students, professionals to mix. I want to thank this panel for a great start.